Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched episode 1 of Lovecraft Country. Let's talk about it. So Lovecraft Country is created by Misha Green, who also created Underground. Now, here's the thing. When I was looking this up, I was very surprised to see that Underground was actually cancelled after 2 seasons under suspicious circumstances. And the theory as to why it was cancelled is allegedly because the broadcasting company or the production company or someone associated with that series was purchased by a conservative broadcasting or telecoms company, and they may have urged the production company to drop the series because it didn't quite align with their beliefs or their company ethics. I find it very interesting that allegedly we might be looking at an instance of censorship that may have happened. I think it's super unfortunate because the kind of story that Underground told was something that was very novel and very interesting and exciting to see, and the show itself was very well regarded. So the fact that it was cancelled under those circumstances is just so upsetting. But now Misha is back with this series and she has some pretty powerful backing behind her. We're talking about J.J. Abrams and Jordan Peele producing this series, so there's definitely names attached to it that give it a bit more of the limelight that it deserves. Now, in terms of my personal interest when it comes to this series, I have to be honest, I'm not built for horror. It's not in my instruction manual. I can't handle horror. I can't handle things that scare me. And the fact that I'm doing this review so late at night, and if you knew how late it was, but I wanted to support my girl Misha Green. This is an African-American woman who has her own show, and it's one that is getting a lot of the spotlight right now. I had to be involved in the movement. I had to support her, so I'm definitely going to be following this show through my reviews every week. Hopefully I'll be able to do a review every week of this series as it goes along. And also the fact that Jordan Peele was attached, like that was definitely something. Like that's the reason why I watched Us. Otherwise I wouldn't have watched Us, but it was directed by Jordan Peele, so I had to. And now let's get into the series itself, and there is a lot to unpack here. But first and foremost, let's talk about the name. When I first heard the name of this series, after having heard about the scandal surrounding George R.R. Martin and his whole Lovecraft spiel that he had during the Hugo Awards and how that was so controversial, I was surprised to see that this series that is produced by a black woman would be named after him, because this author was infamously racist. He got extra points. He got a merit on the racism, on the white supremacy, and it bled into his work. And often the argument when it comes to problematic creators is that you have to separate the art from the artist. In this case, you have an author in H.P. Lovecraft who is very well renowned. He's a very influential author as well. I'm personally not the biggest fan of the sci-fi genre. I haven't really read any of his works or any of the works that are inspired by him, so I can't really speak to the literature itself, but anyone can see that he has had a major impact in literature over the last century or so. In this case, you do have his influential works, and that's something that can be analyzed on themselves, but then you also have the aspect of his works kind of having elements of his political views, his socio-political views in them, as is cited in this episode where we see the characters of Tick and Uncle George both talking about Lovecraft and his work and his inherent racism within the works themselves. And at the very beginning of the episode, we also have another mention of Lovecraft's problematic past, and we see that Tick is talking to a black woman on the bus, and his argument for supporting the sci-fi genre, even though he knows it has inherent issues, especially during this time, is that he sees the stories as he sees human beings, where you love them even though you know they have issues, even though you know that they're not perfect. And so he chooses to look over those issues as opposed to focusing on them and preventing them from enjoying the story, whereas the woman comes back at him and says, well, those issues are still there. Even though you choose not to see them, those issues are still there. I think the show did an excellent job of addressing straight from the top the controversies that surround the character of Lovecraft and his influence that he's had on the genre. It wants to pay tribute to his works, but it doesn't want to pay tributes to the character, the man himself, because of his racist viewpoints, his white supremacy, controversy. Thankfully, the show doesn't shy away from that controversy and it addresses it head on. And it also leaves us with no clear answer, because there is no clear answer when it comes to a character who is so influential in any field, but at the same time, his personal politics are just so controversial and so wrong. So this exploration of the controversial nature of Lovecraft himself and some of his works is also combined with the setting of this show. Now, this show takes place in the 1940s, I believe, straight after the World War, and you can see that there are definite implications of Jim Crow and the lives of Black people during this time. This show does not shy away from the realities, the hard-hitting realities of being a Black person in America during this time. It's heartbreaking. Now, in light of this, going back to the name Lovecraft Country, instead of viewing it as somewhat of a tribute to Lovecraft himself, having seen the first episode and having seen the themes that are going to be explored throughout this show, most likely, one way in which I've chosen to interpret the name is as a searing analysis and a searing condemnation of what it meant for Black people to live in Lovecraft's country. This is what it meant for them to live at a time under Jim Crow, with segregation, with lynchings, with attacks, and there's nothing that is desirable or positive or aspirational in the slightest, despite the fact that we constantly have this juxtaposition of, themes of the American dream. You also have James Baldwin's 1965 speech talking about the fallacy of the American dream and what it actually means to be a Negro in this time in that country, and that is juxtaposed excellently, brilliantly against the racism and the racist attacks that these characters face as they're traveling along the Midwest. So I think the series is definitely going to be tackling a ton of racial issues within this period, and I'm not surprised considering the talents that are associated with the series. And also, as a side note, I have to relish in the fact that having this kind of story be told with these kinds of characters within the genre that was created by Lovecraft may be Lovecraft's worst nightmare. And I think it's a kind of screw you to him and his ideology, because you see these Black characters who are at the center of a Lovecraftian story. Now I want to run through some of the characters themselves. I already touched upon a couple of them, but I want to run through my thoughts on each of them at the beginning of this series. And first of all, we have the character of Atticus Freeman, who's portrayed by Jonathan Majors. Now, I was first introduced to Jonathan Majors in one of my favorite films of last year. That was The Last Black Man of San Francisco, and I think he was brilliant there. And having seen him in this show now, I can even more appreciate his performance in that film, because it was a first introduction, it was the first role that I'd ever seen him play. But having seen him portray this character who is entirely different on this show, and it just proves that he's a very versatile actor, and I'm very impressed with his performance so far on this show. Now, Atticus, or Tick as he is called, is a war veteran, and he is on the search for his father, who mysteriously vanished sometime 2 weeks ago. Now, his father is known to be a drunk and someone that rubs people the wrong way. He doesn't have great relationship with his son, so it takes a while for anyone to notice that he is missing, but he is indeed, and he has left behind this cryptic message that Atticus is just trying to figure out and trace him by. But Atticus himself is dealing with his own issues, because during this time you have a ton of soldiers coming back home, especially in the case of Black soldiers, and they find themselves in an environment that is entirely unwelcoming. And this is something that was very well explored in one of the films that I continue to push down your throats, and that is Mudbound. Wow, another opportunity for me to talk about the excellence that is Mudbound, because this is a theme that is explored very well there, especially in the context of someone who came from the South and was coming back from war. Definitely check out Netflix's Mudbound if this is something that interests you, or at the very least check out my thoughts on Mudbound in my best movies of the decade video. But this is something that is explored in that film, and again we're seeing the same theme being rolled over here, because it seems as though Tick has an antagonistic relationship with his father that was worsened by the fact that he went off to war, and his father completely disapproved of his decision because he believes that Tick has no business. He has no business fighting on behalf of a country that despises him. And throughout this episode, like I said before, we see so many instances of racism and racist attacks that you kind of feel for Tick's father. Even though we haven't met him and even though we haven't seen him, you feel for him already. You sympathize with him already, because you can see why he disapproved of his son going off to war to fight on behalf of this country, a country that treats him like this. Really? He's a war hero and he's being treated like an animal to be hunted. It's despicable. So I completely understand his father's perspective, even though there are other elements to his character that are clearly unsavory. Next up, we have the character of Letitia Lewis, who is portrayed by Jenny Smollett. Now, I had a few thoughts when I saw this character pop out of nowhere in the middle of this episode. When we are first introduced to her, she steps up on stage where her sister is singing and performing and everyone is having a fun time with her, and she kind of tries to take over. It seems as though there's definitely a sibling rivalry between Ruby and Letitia, and so that's something that is very quickly and efficiently explored just during that set where they're singing together, and it sounds amazing. They're both incredibly talented singers, but I definitely think it was an effective way of showing us already as an audience. We already know the dynamics between the sister. We already know the antagonism that exists there before they even have the conversation after the performance. But then they do have that conversation and it is revealed that Letitia has been, wandering off, getting up to who knows what. In the meantime, she did not make it to their mother's funeral, which is definitely something that her sister and later on we find out her brother is holding against her. It's something that they're viciously angry at her for. And it seems like just in general, the character of Letitia is very independent. She's not really someone that is tied down to her family, perhaps for reasons that will be told to us later on in this series, but she doesn't have those close family ties like that. She has her own goals and ambitions that she wants to work towards, and it seems as though maybe she's not financially stable and maybe she's not focused on stability just in general, but rather exploring as much of the country or maybe even the world as she wants to and she can, and then she kind of comes home to her family whenever she needs something, which is definitely something that does not sit right with her sister. Now, I have to be honest, when I first saw this character and her sister, I kind of side-eyed the situation a little bit because Jenny Smollett is of course mixed race. She is lighter skinned, so to have her portray the sister of Ruby was a little bit confusing for me. Perhaps there's a story behind that and perhaps that will be explored again later on in this series, but I definitely think there's something there because even her brother is much darker skinned, so it's definitely something interesting there in their family dynamic, and I wonder if they're going to explore that further, or perhaps maybe they thought that it wouldn't be a big deal and no one would notice. I hope that's not the case. I don't think it's the case. And the next character that I wanted to explore a little bit is Courtney B. Vance's George Freeman. Now, this is a very interesting character because it seems as though when you first meet him, he's so jovial, he's so full of love, especially for his wife. It was very nice to see this, older, kind of middle-aged black couple just loving on each other. I think it was something that is very novel, unfortunately, to see in a series or in a film, and it was something that was very welcome, even though it was quite cringy because they're parents and they're cringy, embarrassing selves, but they definitely had an amazing relationship as husband and wife as well as parents to their daughter, and that's something that was very welcome to see. He seems to be a bookstore owner, or at least someone who manages the bookstore, and also on the side he also seems to be publishing a green book of sorts, which is supposed to help African Americans in long journeys, any long journeys that they may take throughout the country, because of course during this time under Jim Crow there are places in this country that do not want to see any dark skin. They don't want to hear nor see any of it, and if you find yourself in the wrong place, unfortunately that could cost you your life, that could cost you your children's life as well. So the fact that he's kind of doing the Lord's work during this time in the 50s, like, that's crazy, and he is publishing these guides to help other African Americans travel around the country wherever they may go, I think is absolutely amazing. So the introduction of this character already has you in high spirits because he seems like such a cool guy. As we get on though, we do see the little nicks in his character which kind of take him from being a cool guy to a complex character. We see the nicks in his relationship with his wife and how he has excluded her in a lot of his journeys and a lot of his adventures. You can see that whilst he respects his wife, he loves his wife, he he loves his daughter, he kind of patronizes them. Because of course, even throughout the Black community, we still have a strong patriarchy, and you can see how he has fallen victim to that, and that affects the way that he sees his wife and his daughter. And so throughout the show, you see him referring to Letitia as girl, and that kind of reduces her value in a way, like it's kind of dismissive of her womanhood. And it gets to the point where Letitia has to stand up for herself and tell him, my name is Letitia Lewis, that is how I want to be referred to, nothing else. And it kind of gets into his head, and he realizes that this is a woman who has a lot of value, a lot of power in her own right, and perhaps it allows him to reflect on how he treats his wife and his daughter, which I found was endearing and incredible to see already so much character development within one episode of the show. Another issue with this character that we see get addressed is with his relationship with Tick, and how Tick feels like he didn't really stand up for him whilst his father was abusing him and treating him badly due to his alcoholism and anger issues, as we can kind of infer in the mentions of his father throughout this show. Now, that was such a powerful moment because George had been talking about how he felt bad for letting his brother down. It was his younger brother and he was the little one, and he got picked on a lot by their, I'm guessing, father, and I'm guessing there was a similar issue of alcoholism and anger within their family as well that kind of carried on, that was inherited by George's brother. And so he's lamenting on how he didn't do as much as he possibly could have in order to defend his brother when they were younger. But then in that moment, Tick kind of turns it on him and says, well, you still didn't do anything for me when you saw how my father was treating me. You see how whilst he is incredibly jovial and loving and caring and a positive influence as a patriarchal figure within this story, he still has his issues. It's not like he's a perfect character, which again makes him a bit more complex and a bit more nuanced. Now let's get into some of these story aspects of this show. Now, like I said before, the whole premise starts off with Tick finding a letter from his father who has disappeared sometime 2 weeks ago, and he's off to chase after his father, and he's joined by Uncle George and Letitia. Now, the setup for this premise is pretty simple. You have a kind of road trip storyline, but then it's kind of embedded and embellished with all of these horrific acts of racism that are to be expected but are still no less shocking to see. Now, these scenes range from having a momentary cameo from Aunt Jemima to having these random, white kids at a gas station mocking these characters and calling them monkeys and making monkey noises in this obnoxious and horrific way. And then, of course, you have the king of all kings of Midwestern racism. Wow. You have this incredibly fascist and racist sheriff who sneaks up on them quietly and slowly when they're in the middle of a forest. Now, apparently they had found themselves in a sundown town, which meant that after dark, any black people that were seen roaming the streets, living their lives during the night, were a threat, were at a real risk of being killed or lynched or anything of the sort. It was a free-for-all after dark when it came to how people could treat black people in a sundown town. That, listen, that is just so horrific. And it was so horrific to see that scene play out where the sheriff is playing mind games with them, and Atticus is just trying to handle the situation calmly but cleverly, and the sheriff doesn't like that. The sheriff doesn't like to see a black man who seems to, have it together up here. He knows the mind games that he's playing with him, but the sheriff sees that as a challenge and a nuisance. It's something that disrupts his narrow-minded and horrific worldview and perception of black people. So he tries to demean Atticus and gets him to call himself the N-word, which is just, it's such a heartbreaking scene. And then promptly afterwards, we have this chase. We have this car chase, the likes of which I have never seen before, where they are literally running for their lives, or rather driving for their lives, because they need to get to the next county ASAP. Except the car can't even go particularly fast, because then the sheriff would stop them for speeding. So on top of those mind games that the sheriff was playing, he's also presented so many obstacles to prevent them from getting away. But then that brings us to the big moment where we finally get the horror elements of this series playing out. Now, already we saw horror elements, but they were more socio-political horror elements in terms of the racism that was on display in this episode. But we actually got some monsters. We actually got some creatures of the night, and they, wow. First of all, as a credit to the show, I will say that the monsters themselves looked very good. They were definitely materialized very well using CG and perhaps maybe some practical effects as well, but they looked convincing. I will say that they did look best when they were shrouded by a shadow or shrouded by the night. I think when you saw too much light hit them, it kind of became a little bit less believable and a little bit less something that I would be genuinely afraid of. And this is coming from me, who is legit a scaredy cat. But then in terms of the effects themselves, we do see the monsters attack the police officers as well as the sheriff in this incredibly satisfying way. But then of course all of the remaining characters end up huddling in this cabin away from the monsters who are quickly approaching them. And then we find out that, you know, what happens when a vampire bites a human being? They end up turning into a vampire. Now this is a very interesting type of vampire. It's not quite Edward Cullen, but he's definitely a horrific monster. And I wonder if, you know, the rules of vampirism apply here in terms of, you know, the garlic and the everything like that. But anyways, in this case, we saw that the light was a huge weakness when it came to these monsters. And so that's how they fought them off, with Letitia running for her life to get to the car so that she could use the headlights to scare them off. And I thought that was a very high impact and incredibly well executed scene. I did feel the tension there. I did feel the horror aspects there. I think they were very effective. And then finally at the very end, we see the gang end up at this huge mansion, this huge luscious mansion in the town of Ardham, and they find themselves greeted by this guy, this white guy, who says, you know, welcome home, we've been expecting you. And so that kind of relates to the letter that Tig got from his father, saying that there were certain things that were owed to him, certain things that were his destiny and that ran from his mother's bloodline, you know, all that situation. It seems as though that's related to this mansion. So overall, I very much enjoyed this show, and I'm interested to see how it plays out in the next 7 episodes. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on the first episode of Lovecraft Country, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this series down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. I do plan on posting a weekly video for each episode of this series that airs, so please be sure to subscribe so you make sure that you can catch those. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.